bit of heart and probably putting quite a few people off this one, so I don't know what to do. It's still very, it's so open that one can't really
Did they use that fabric? I mean, they are using Teflon.
I'm Mr. Scissors.
Yes, here it is.
It's going to be there with my tube of glass stick. Peter, I have 22.5 minutes.
Okay.
I should start. You can speak for two.
I'd just like to welcome everybody here this afternoon, and it might be useful if I just introduce who is here and what is here. Working round the room, the work on in this apps here is by Mark Fisher, who is with us for the next 22 minutes, after which he has to take a plane to New York. He's the gentleman in the Fair Isle sweater and the clear glasses. Then we have the work. Mark, incidentally, was a student at the AA up to about 3 years ago, and now is running one of the first-year units at the AA. And his description of his work is in ArtNet 2 on the brown pages. Mark Primack is still a student, just coming into 5th year. Was originally at Rhode Island School of Design, and in fact comes from Providence. And he also is here this afternoon. At the end is the work of a student at the AA who finished at the end of this summer, Austrian, Cyrillian guy, who is at the moment working in Paris on the Plateau Bobo scheme with Piano and Rogers. And so he can't be with us this afternoon. And then moving round behind a row of heads here is the work of Paul Shepherd, who finished at the AA 2 years ago, and I think is already back again teaching in one of the diploma school units. I don't think he's going to come this afternoon. Rumour has it that he may not actually come. And finally, Will Alsop, another, I suppose, product of the AA, who also, interestingly, studied at art college before he ever decided to do architecture, and is also back again, amongst other things, teaching at St. Martin's. And I think this sort of art architecture connotation may be something that we pick up later in the afternoon. Having said that, I'd like to introduce the panel of worthies here this afternoon. Alvin Boyarsky, Director General of the Architectural Association, Canadian, sometime raconteur of wit, has taught at other places actually before. I mean, there was a life before he ever came to the AA, which included Oregon and Cornell and Montreal and other things. Then, on my right, immediately, Dr. Dalibor Vasily, who, interestingly, was trained as an engineer and an architect before doing his doctorate in art history. And he comes from Prague and was a member of the group called the Continualists, which still continues, fortunately based on Paris. My name is Peter Cook. I'm incognito this afternoon. And then I move quickly on to James Gowan, who I'm sure you all know was one of the authors of the engineering building at Leicester, a very strange house for Mr. Schreiber in Hampstead, and various other housing works. What I think is interesting about James Gowan is that he's one of the sort of hidden gurus of the present situation at the AA. Even though he's not actually on the payroll this year, he's still one of the people that has influenced a lot of people who are, which I think is worth saying. Even though if you look in the current issue of, or the current book called Radical Architecture, you'll see that he's recently designed a giraffe, which I'm sure he'll be able to explain at some other occasion. We then, moving leftwards, have Cedric Price, frequently featured in the supplement, Cedric Price supplement, raconteur, bon viveur, wit, hoping to leave this terrible room in the next half hour if I go on like that.
Shortly.
And the rest of our particular bit of the faculty, as they say, Ingrid Morris, who had an extensive introduction yesterday, I think, and Ron Heron,
Wonderful relation.
mate, partner, archigram, all of that. That's the panel, but I assume that people will blow in and blow out as they feel the need. I wonder, Mark, since you have to catch a TWA 403,
What do we do? Do we hold up cards with numbers? Or?
the second mark on the right is here, and I think if the authors are here, it's interesting to hear what they have to say. The three that
If you shift it out a bit, nothing wrong with it.
he doesn't want to actually. Ingrid,
No, I was going to. I know that he's going to miss that.
There's another thing. There's another thing. I rather want.
Can you get in?
That's all right, I'll stay here.
Will I move down there and let you in?
No,
I've gone out.
As long as it looks good on the screen,
I don't think I could introduce this as anything other than an academic project. It was done at Rhode Island School of Design in conjunction with a course by a man by the name of Friedrich C. Florin, who was teaching a studio course called The Art of Designing a Building. And I was sitting one day listening to Herr Liebermeister rattling on. He said something about ultimately reacting to a building with all five senses, and that you should design with that in mind. And since we could design any type of building we wanted, I thought I'd design a type of building that was meant for the five senses. And researching that, I came upon Caracalla of Rome, which were much more than a bath. They served as a civic center, housing forums for poets and libraries and lecture halls and concert areas and just about everything. And keeping in mind that it was an academic project, I picked up another little dogma of Corbusier's as far as the plan being a generator and the essence of a building being within that plan. I decided to create a civic center for the city I was in at the time, using the plan of the Caracalla as a generator. So what I did was I modified the the outer building, well, let me explain this. You've got an outer building and inner building. Most of the activities take place here. What I do is I modify the outer building to act as a continuous footing for a Fry-Otto designed inflatable, low-profile inflatable that's internally restrained in 3 places, also drained in those places, and so that the interior became a climate-controlled space. And the plan of the interior building was translated into a topographic map, so that the spaces and the functions were not separated by walls anymore. They were separated by changes in elevation, and the interior became a Garden of Eden of sorts, with the baths as cold, warm, and hot water ponds in this landscaped environment with all your support facilities underneath. That's this project. This is what I'm working on now, and it's probably me as a megalomaniac, and what I'm trying to do is influence evolution, and taking into account that man supposedly is the only species who's aware of evolution and therefore in a position to do something about it. I thought it might be a good idea to propose what I would consider a much better future than what we seem to be heading towards. And it involves a different technology, the development of a biological technology, which would ultimately lead to, for lack of a better word, botanical architecture. And well, I could spend about 20 minutes explaining each one of the images, and that might bore everybody solid, but
You just do one.
okay. The first one, that's basically the prologue to the whole thing. That's a pseudoscorpion. A pseudoscorpion eats mites, and mites are very important in as nitrogen fixers, and they maintain that nitrogen cycle, which is important for life on the planet. But if the mites get out of hand, they get too numerous, and start eating away at the roots of plants and start causing a little bit of destruction. All the pseudoscorpions do is
could I make a comment? It's very curious that you use the same root source as palladium, and that you then tackled it in a different way. You know, taking the Caracalla baths, instead of concentrating on the details and making big things of them, you've done something which is, one wouldn't like to say it's a demolition job, but it's artistically something similar to that. There's some sort of artistic reversing, you know? And curiously, the last drawing that you finish up with is quite often akin to the first drawing in architectural thinking. You know.
yeah. Well, admittedly, at the time, I saw formal architecture as more or less a statement, well, as kind of an archaeology, where you got guys like Venturi and Philip Johnson who were doing nothing more than picking out ancient design elements and butchering them into modern buildings. And so that's basically what I was doing if I had to design a building. Try that. It was 100% an academic exercise.
But it's rather more than that, because you see, if you compare the outcome to a Palladian building is particularized in its elements and fastidious. And quite honestly, the thing you end up with is quite the opposite of that. It's a big generalized statement. It's almost like an elephant's foot, artistically, isn't it? You know, the thing on the top.
Well, yeah, the thing on the top, I guess I couldn't defend that very well at all, but the point is that the building covers 30 acres, and the interior would be like a large park that you get lost in and become unaware of the structure around you. And that was basically what I was concentrating on.
My only other part was the very last drawing, bottom right. I think it's so beautiful. The divine description that really very nice.
Silence.
Well, I too feel offended by the way you've taken what is an old-fashioned architectural game, which is to take a plan of something, overlay it with perhaps another idea, expand aspects of it, and come up with something which is a comment on the original. You know, to the best of my knowledge, unless there's something that escapes the eye, you're not engaging into any kind of a witty dialogue with what the baths of Karkala spawned, you know, for hundreds of years. You know, there's been an awful lot of conversations with that building over the generations and decades and so on. And I mean, you've almost made it into a piece of gasketry, which is an interesting comment. It's sort of 1967 sort of Ron Perrin or Warren Chalk kind of imagery, but there's so much in between that, and I mean, Claudio is one kind of connotation, but I mean, it is essentially an ideal. It's a paradise which has rough edges where people actually come up and buy things and so on from the outside, and it's a place for decadent pleasure. Not just for poets and authors, but it's a kind of, you know, it's sort of a place where some kind of sensual performance, you know, is permitted and so on. And it has certain geometries and whole vocabulary about it, and you've done something very, very, I think, gross with the whole idea. And I wish perhaps that you'd been able to translate that kind of landscape notion into those terms, but I don't think that's what you've been trying to do.
No, I've got it.
Can I disagree, actually? Because I remember seeing this scheme, first of all, in one of those absurd situations when one is looking at portfolios quite at random, didn't know who the guy was, just happened to come upon it in some funny way. And for the precise reasons that it gets up Alvin's nose, I found it absolutely engaging and fascinating. And for the reason that I think that one of the most interesting aspects of architecture as analysed, or architecture as one rather self-consciously can play with it, is to see what happens to a set of ideas at the point of their maximum disintegration. To take, and in this case perhaps the metaphor is a simple one, which is an existing building, but to see what happens to that set of forces, that set of spaces, ideas, arrangements, whatever, and push it and push it and push it to the point where it practically disintegrates. And I think, and I remember years ago having the same attitude to something quite different, which is the notion of system building. I remember feeling for a period of time that system building could get really interesting if one could take a system and pervert it, coerce it, warp it, misuse it, push it to the point at which it virtually became inept, but not quite. Or if one could take a geometry, let us say, and play with it and contort it and bitch it and be eccentric to it, but not totally. And somewhere in my mind there's a sort of magic territory, which is where the thing is still traceable back to its origins, and where it hasn't. I mean, anybody can sort of blow the thing sky high and say, right, to hell with that, you know. But to still retain some elements of it, but to be contorting it, I think is a very sort of magic experience. And that was precisely, it's rather curious, that it's precisely the quality that, as I say, got up Alvin's nose, that I found absolutely fascinating about this. I thought, my God, yes, you know, a distorted, a kind of creepy, dying, warped almost untraceable bars of Caracalla is infinitely more fascinating than the original thing, which can be, you know, Wittkever or somebody could go through that like a fine-tooth comb and explain why it's all like this. But somewhere there is a point, and this is really a kind of paradigm of one's view of architecture as a whole, that the tradition of architecture is useful up to the point at which one can actually distort it or pervert it. And it is still useful while one is in the process of perverting. If one does a total perversion, then it, you know, then one's got nothing. And this is why, and I think that it's interesting that in a sense, although the second project, and I know how you personally feel about this Caracalla thing, but that's some of the past you did at Rhode Island and all of that, and really you're into something that's much more fascinating, and you're almost, as I remember, embarrassed about this. In a way, the statement of an objective, and you do state a certain kind of objective, albeit warped and almost impossible to achieve, of a sort of biomorphic architecture. In a funny way, I think that is a much more traditional thing to be doing, in the sense that there is a consistent program, albeit that the consistent program doesn't lead to a consistent set of devices, but there is a sort of total program of trying to evolve this other architecture, which is the opposite of this other scheme. This is decadent. That is optimistic. You know, that is heroic. This is decadent. This is the end of this contortion and the, you know, withering embers. But that is back into the tradition of heroism and looking forward and so on. And that's curious. I mean, the new drawings are much more elegant, which goes without saying.
Could I say I agree that perhaps that's a more optimistic statement, but insofar as Peter has introduced a sort of autobiographical element in discussing your work, perhaps one should pick it up just a little bit. And this whole description of a personal struggle against a mark on paper or a form or a set of facts, which may or may not be culturally loaded for the individual manipulating them, as it seems system building or bats of Caracalla. But it could be a fantastic, it's sort of like somebody going into a gymnasium and kind of, I don't know, throwing a ball against the wall simply for the sweat and developing fantastic rhythm of rebounds off various facets of the gymnasium and so on, and coming up with some kind of fantastic feeling of pleasure and achievement and all the rest of it. But on the other hand, if you are asking some questions of yourself and producing some kind of analytical sort of, if you leave a trail of analysis behind you, which can be loaded in many ways, and on the other hand, you seem to be bending the facts as you discover them willfully in some special direction which can be traced as an idea and so on. There is a dialectic, there is a conflict, and there is, if not heroic outcome, at least some kind of resolution to problems which you may not have begun with but have been engendered by the whole business. But my objection to this is not the fact that it is no longer a Wittkevian sort of diagram at the end of it, but that it's impossible really to describe the experience of the person doing it and the kind of resolution he came to. The final product is this sort of non-event with regard to the potential at the beginning. And I think it's on that basis, autobiographically, sort of, or, you know, as an experience in time, it's a sort of a failure, you know, in that sense. And as for the other part of the work, I haven't really had the time to explore it. And it's as with Mark Fisher's work, there's a sort of a mystic belief, you know, that a return to the atom and to genetics and to ecology and so on, we'll find a new route. Now, I mean, I don't want to get involved in expanding that into problems of our time and looking for new beginnings, but I would say that it's a worthwhile research, you know, and we all look forward to elegant drawings like the one in the bottom right-hand corner, and also into some kind of triggering of other people's sensibilities which comes from it. And I look forward to that part of your work a great deal.
That's what's coming.
Yeah, I mean, in conclusion, probably I'll not make any contribution to what was said already, but there's still more interesting thing on the way. See, what I find very interesting, your choice, and I've seen already several examples like that being done, very actually rarely with success, because it's a bloody difficult thing. I mean, it's very easy to make a statement at the beginning and say, you know, pick up any building you want. I don't think it really matters which one you pick. But once you've done the decision, you are in it, and you are in the game, you're playing it, and if you like it or not, you know, the scene or the situation is playing it with you. And now it depends very much how strong you are, and I think, you know, there's something like a challenge. And the, you know, the easy start is always becoming a much more difficult end, because if you don't end up with something which is at least bears the challenge, then you're making, well, to say the least, fool of yourself, or you're wasting time, or you just you lost the challenge simply. So I don't want to say what is the outcome of that, because, you know, one can see it. But it's a pity that, you know, what was left on the way, that's what I really want to talk about, is something which wasn't really used. It's something like, again, a gap becoming a cross here, that, you know, we are obviously convinced with your assumptions and whatever you said at the beginning, you know, fair enough, you know, it is nothing especially original, but it's still very interesting, because so often failed possibilities, that you take something seriously into a dialogue and confront it. And, you know, we'll see what happens in confrontation, but then you have to take all the responsibility for the outcome. And, you know, in that case, you know, God be with you. Again, I don't want to make the conclusion just repeat what was said. I think I'll probably not say very much different. You know, we can see that this can be continued and maybe taken again in a much more serious way. Not serious in bloody old-fashioned way, but, you know, sense there, but, you know, seriously in terms of exploiting what is really involved in the game you're taking. Because it will tell you something about yourself. Right? You know, that's something which is probably even more interesting than, you know, just playing game with already outdated and antiquated issues. I'm much more interested actually in the second one, which again I feel rather sort of perplexed, not knowing enough about the invisible, as this seems to be referring so much to. So I think it's very dangerous to admire the drawing, which one can very easily. If you have certain sensibility, reading graphics, you got you know, the message through that level. But apparently that's not what the thing is about. Now, what you said at the beginning, and I don't want to ask you to talk more, but definitely what you said so far, I'm more sort of rather put off than put on. I find it very dubious, and in fact, I guess that as more as you will be talking, there will be probably greater and greater conflict between the invisible intention, I mean, you know, the content of your, again, thinking and your sort of ideas about possibilities, how you can manipulate, you know, the micro world in relation to the macro in which you operate with your drawing. Because, you know, it's very difficult, again, challenging world to go into, far more difficult than what you started with. What I, in then, just to end up, you know, the comment I'm making, what I find very interesting about that you seem, and I invite it enormously, you know, taking the challenge, that you seem to be somehow obsessed with the kind of dialogue which you can take and turn into challenge. What I found frustrating and to a certain extent, well, it's probably too early to say disappointing, that you don't seem to finish the job. You're somehow sort of impatient. You know, I mean, I don't know what you're going to do now, or what you're doing now if you're sitting at home and working on that, but it seems to me that even if you will describe it more in detail, that it's still a just open sort of possibility without saying the right word in the right place in the right moment, which means turning it at least to a provisory conclusion. You know, when you have really to face the challenge, you started with, because that's really where you face yourself in a mirror. And it's either distorted or it's straight. So far you avoided the possibility to see yourself in a mirror.
Well, it's just a question.
I think that's what we are artificially more or less simulating, trying to do here. You know, the mirror is part of the conversation we're leading here.
Well, there's another way
we're
of
forcing
saying
the position, saying, you know, you should really do that.
There's another way of saying that. If this botanic architecture is really going to progress and so on, it's not self-induced graphics and sort of graphic techniques of finding a few facts about nitrogen and so on. But it requires a heavy scientific base. It means you have to hang up your pencil for a long time and get yourself to a point where you're in control of the vocabulary you're dealing in its potential. Maybe not. Maybe you can intuitively spark off notions which other people are better equipped. But I mean, you know, given the paths open to one in the world of building at this point in time, you know, they're well marked. You either do your best given the circumstances, or you try to develop alternative services and alternative ways of solving problems, or you're trying to produce ideas which will transform what will happen in years to come. But if you take that route and you leave the action, the field of action, so to speak, in the real world, then that has to have a fantastic self-discipline. Has to have a spine to it.
Sure, but to contrast that with the previous work, I'm not calling for scientists to get together and create this, you know, and manipulate nature. And that's not, if that's the idea you've got.
No, I'm not. I'm just putting the two together.
Yeah, well, to me, they're worlds apart.
Yes.
It's a problem. See, I'm talking about a natural evolution, which would come from man, from a growing awareness in man and a growing closeness with the natural system, in a process of throwing off of the technology that we have today, which has been a substitute for man's physical evolution anyways. You know? Well, this gets into a number of quotes. I mean, one of which is the fact that it's man's tools that have evolved rather than man physically. The fact that you or I have as many hair follicles in our body as an ape or a gorilla. You know, it's our hands, our minds, and our tools that have evolved. And history shows that evolution generally leads to extinction because a species evolves physically, become more and more specialized to environment. The environment changes, and that's it. You know, but the wonderful thing about man is that in a quote primitive state, he's still capable of living, you know, in the Arctic, and he's capable of living in the Sahara. And it's the tools that become more and more specialized. And the way it looks, it's the tools that'll work their way towards extinction. With a little bit of luck, man might survive it. And to survive it, he's going to have to develop this alternative technology. And that's what it's all about.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. Actually, you and Mark, had he been able to stay, it would have been nice actually to ask you both together. I'm very interested in that second project and also in what he was talking about, and wonder whether you've obviously read a lot more than I have about all this, and whether these are what you have drawn and what Mark has drawn are science fiction dreams of what might happen in the future when we are much more aware of nature than we are at the moment. But I'm wondering whether there are any, at the moment, there are some, whether you found in your reading some evidence of the beginnings of this actually happening, whether you see some present examples of man manipulating nature to this extent. Well, not to this extent, but even the beginnings of this.
Well, I couldn't think of any real sources to quote other than a few individuals, you know, people like Lauren Isley or even Bernowski. And that's the type of thing that I'm concerned with. I'm not concerned with the genetics, with the mutations, with all of that. But the idea is that hopefully everybody is driven subconsciously or even deeper than the subconscious level by some image of the future.
Yeah.
And that's what carries them on, you know. And if the image of the future is ugly, if it's overpopulation, if it's all this garbage, then it leads to certain things. It leads to revivals of past crazes, you know, it leads to celebration of destruction, you know, which is something I think Venturi does a little bit of, you know. And that doesn't get anywhere. And the idea is that if you can plan another picture of the future down there, then it without a doubt, it will lead to something better.
Yes, but you must be relying on manipulating nature to his... No. You seem to think it's going to happen.
Well, you know, there are a lot of crackpots around. You know, I mean, there are books like Secret Life of Plants. There are many. You know, more and more people these days are talking to plants, and more and more people are enjoying plants. And there's, well, all right, I will. I'll tell you a very interesting story. Oh, well, I consider it to be an interesting story out of a book called The Parable of the Beast by a guy named Bleetrow. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but in this book he's talking about the pineal gland. He's stating that nobody really knew what it was all about until very recently, except for the ancient Hindus who knew what it was about. And recently they found that, well, the 17th century French philosophers felt that it was the bridge between the body and the soul because it was located where your spinal column is your brain. It's just this little gland, and it's found that it produces these hormones that act as a balancing agent on your brain. And if the pineal gland is upset and the hormones are not produced at the right quantity, then you get schizophrenia in one form, clinical schizophrenia. You know, it could be anything. And then they found that, say, LSD works on the pineal gland and it creates this schizophrenia. And then it was pointed out that the major hormone of the pineal gland is chemically identical to certain plant hormones, and particularly certain fig hormones. And the one fig that it's most prolific in was called by the Indians the bow tree. And it was the bow tree that the Buddha sat beneath for I don't know how many years before he gained enlightenment, you see. So I'm dealing with connections like that, and I'm not talking about manipulating, I'm just talking about getting back into it. And as I'm conscious of the fact that man is evolving, I also feel that the natural system is evolving too. If the two can get together, then that's what will come out of it.
Because that's interesting what you're just saying, because you just pick up one type of conversation and obviously you can follow it with certain consistency. Now, I would like to make a very sort of simple, perhaps final comment. It's rather mundane. That, as I said at the beginning, I do admire the attempt. Now, what it seems to me almost impossible is to try suddenly in the middle of everything. I mean, this is a sphere. It's a world on its own, which has series of levels on which the same conversation is going on. I mean, from the biologists, from the very sort of specialized specialists, dealing with a particular issue like, the endocrinology on one end, and then you go to the level of science fiction on the opposite end. Now, I can obviously understand that, there is a possibility in any of those levels to pick up the issue, follow it certain lengths, and translate it into language which you fancy as a language. I mean, there is a language here, whatever we describe it doesn't matter. There is a language here which has a certain level, because you can't operate at the same time in 3, 4, 5 different levels. I mean, it came out from the conversation before that you can afterwards bring the second level into it, but it's an addition. You have to, listen about that. We can't look at it. Now, you're looking at that language and trying, in fact, to do, I would say a really impossible thing. I don't like to make finite statements, but impossible thing to, go right across the whole spectrum of conversation from the very sort of minute specialist one on the left hand and the science fiction on the other, bring it all together into one sort of, again, sort of commanding image. And, make the step, further. Now, I believe that if it's possible at all, you can do it maybe somewhere on the way, but certainly not at the beginning, because, simply the image itself has no capacity, almost by definition, to go with the whole spectrum of, so detached sphere like the conceptual level of genetics and science fiction on the other end.
See, that's the problem, because
You see, you find it in literature sometimes, that is brought together. And perhaps sometimes, it's not the first time I saw it in, the attempt you do to bring it into a visual language. But the first thing is inevitably a hybrid. And now it depends what you do with the hybrid. And I think, this comes to what I was talking before about, that, it could be still taken as a very, very sort of promising beginning of something which has no continuation yet. And I think it would be rather unfair to make, again, final statements about that stage, because I would like to believe that, for you it's not a end of the whole story.
Exactly. Except, to me, the crucial thing is to keep it on as many different levels as I can, because that will be the thing that tells whether it's successful or not. To get.
See, but again, I'm sorry to repeat the word. The crucial point is the translation and your ability to do it, to translate.
Sure. So perhaps it's an impossible task. I don't know.
Because we are living there in a world of grave fragmentation. Let's accept it, and there's nothing really nobody to blame for that. It's here. So if you take it, fair enough, but depends what you do with it. And you have to really translate before you can continue, because otherwise you're operating permanently in a triplicate schizophrenia.
I'm unhappy about this conversation. It's getting me depressed. And the unhappiness has something to do with the rejection of the people, everyone who's discussing the drawings, of the responses that their senses make to the drawing. And I would like to underline this point. I reserve the right that if I look at a drawing and think it's beautiful, that it remains beautiful after I look into it. I reserve that first instinctive right, If I do feel that if we were confronted with a Blake drawing, that we would be saying how anatomically ill-informed it was. He hadn't seen enough naked ladies, and we didn't much care for his branch of Christianity. We could very well get into that conversation, but curiously, the Blake drawings have an immense power, So this point I would reserve in looking at all the drawings. But where I would agree with most of the people who've spoken about your bouts of Caracalla is that you've done something that is perhaps more serious than you imagine. But I think you have the right. I think an artist has the right to really do anything in his art, because the field that he is operating in is understood by the observer. He can turn the world upside down. It's our understanding of the artist that it is within his rights and power of the canvas to do that. But behind that, I do feel that you have done something dramatic and almost fearful, and that is that you have taken the whole of accumulated classical vocabulary, which is enveloped in the bouts of Caracalla, and you reduce them to an amorphous fluidity. And this is a serious thing, because as you look closer and closer at that intention, you are demolishing a whole speech, a whole vocabulary. You are saying, I'm prepared to do that. I'm willing to discard it for the sake of this, And curiously, the brashness of the statement, it's just curious, isn't it? Ends up in a pancake, isn't it? It is curious. In spite of the refinement of your hand and the thoughtfulness of your intelligence.
It's also so that the mistake or the rationale which produced a lot of those forms and geometries in the end is not all that far away from what you're possibly working towards, which is some kind of cosmology, some kind of abstraction of it, some kind of, what is the expression, meaningful diagrams.
Well, at the risk of throwing a cog into this entire conversation,
being very self-deprecating. I can say that when I did this project, I was not aware of all the conversations that had taken place prior in regard to the Caracal bass, and that the project was done as a reaction to the building of a civic center in Providence, which is nothing more than an auditorium and a restaurant. And I discovered, being an ignorant savage from the States, I discovered the bass of Caracal in a book in the library, and it was that minus all of the classical dialogues that had taken place in the millennia between.
So you mustn't be self-deprecating. You happen to, you have instinctively chosen the best example.
I'm going to be
Sure.
I'm going to be boring and seize that optimistic note as an excuse for moving around the room. There are 3 more sets of work that we should look at, and I think it's quite useful. Although Will Alsop is here, Cedric tells me that Will doesn't want to actually introduce this. Will is the guy in the blue pullover and beige jacket and pale blue shirt and longish hair, cheerful complexion, who remains anonymous in the corner there. He would be willing to answer questions, or he may